So, welcome everybody. Today's show is called How to Take Care of Your Brain. And I am here with Dr. Dale Bredesen. Dr. Bredesen is an expert in neurodegenerative diseases. He's held faculty positions at UCSF, UCLA, University of California in San Diego. He directed the program of aging at the Burnham Institute, and he was the founding president and CEO of Buck Institute. He's the best-selling author of a book, which I highly recommend, called The End of Alzheimer's. It's available on Amazon. You can learn more at apollohealthco.com, and we'll link up in the show notes as well to Dale's other work, research, and books. Dr. Bredesen, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Lucas. Great to talk to you.
You know, before we started, you reminded me of something that I completely slipped my mind before our interview, but I just heard about literally 48 hours ago, which is this approval for a new controversial drug. If I understand right, it's for Alzheimer's, and the controversy is new to me. So maybe we can just start off right there. What's going through your head as you hear about the controversy in and around this new drug that's been approved?
Yeah, there have been so many op-eds since this came out. It led to the resignation of three. It was just almost unheard of three of the expert panel. So this isn't a controversial drug. It's called Aduhelm. The generic name is aducanumab. It's an antibody that binds to amyloid. And so the idea was, when it was originally being developed years ago, amyloid, the thought was that it causes Alzheimer's, and therefore let's remove the amyloid, we'll remove the Alzheimer's. Well, unfortunately, all of the trials showed the opposite. In fact, when you remove the amyloid, you don't remove the Alzheimer's. People didn't get better, and in some cases, they had microhemorrhages in the brain and brain edema. 40% of the people had side effects. So this is not such a great drug, and yet it costs $56,000 per year. So it is a huge expense. And in addition to that, you have to get additional PET scans and additional MRIs. So when all is said and done, you're closer to $100,000 per year for a drug that's never been shown to work. And in fact, in one of the studies, it was worse than placebo. And in another study, it didn't make people better. It didn't make people stabilize. But what it did was it slightly slowed the decline. So instead of declining more rapidly, slightly less rapidly by 22%. So either no effect or a minimal effect. Therefore, no surprise, when the expert committee met last November, they recommended 10-0 that the drug not be approved. However, the FDA then came back and approved it, which was surprising to everyone, led to the three resignations that I mentioned. And the reason that they approved it was actually completely the opposite of the study's findings. What they said was, it was shown to remove amyloid, which it does. No one's arguing with that. And we reasonably expect that that will lead to cognitive benefit. Well, no, that's exactly what the trial showed is not the case. Removing the amyloid does not lead to cognitive benefit. So they said, but because we expect that it will, we'll go ahead and approve it, which is why people are really upset. And there's an amazing article in The Atlantic just a couple of days ago. And one of the things that they pointed out was, this is going to be such an expensive drug that when Medicare now starts to cover this, it will be more expensive than all other covered drugs combined. In addition, it will impact, because of Medicaid, it will impact state budgets to the point that states, which have to have balanced budgets, as the two attorneys pointed out in The Atlantic, they will have to cut back on things like education. So can you imagine your child coming to you and saying, Daddy, my teacher told me we can't do our times tables past 3 because of the Aduhelm cutbacks in education. It's just hard to believe how ridiculous this is. And this is why, people have resigned over this. On the other hand, we all understand, we all want the same thing. We want better outcomes for people with Alzheimer's. But again, multiple experts wrote opinion pieces ahead of this saying, sure, we all want better treatment, but this is not it. This is actually not a treatment that works. And again, it's because it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding that removing amyloid means removing Alzheimer's. That just hasn't panned out.
What is your theory in terms of why this happened? I mean, it seems like again, I'm totally a layman, but from what I've read, it seems like just a total mistake. Like, will they reel this back? Will this be unwound? Or is it going to go through? What are your thoughts in terms of why this happened or how this could have happened? I mean, these systems are in place to make approvals difficult specifically for things like this, right?
It's a great point. And unfortunately, I don't think they can wind it back. And so this
Wow.
is going to end up costing somewhere 50 to $100 billion. So, you could argue on the other side, it's one of the greatest business genius strokes in the world. A group that has nothing to offer is going to be
Yeah.
making 50 to $100 billion. On the other hand, it's going to be on all of our taxes,
Yeah.
on all of our payments. People are going to go into bankruptcy trying to help a loved one when we know it doesn't help loved ones, unfortunately. That is the big problem. And here's why this has happened. I think it's such a great point because the FDA really got it backwards. They equated the amyloid removal with improvement.
Yeah.
That's not what happened. That's exactly the opposite of what was shown by these trials. So here's the problem. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about what Alzheimer's disease is. And as you know, this is what we spent 30 years in the lab looking at. What is this disease? What actually is going on? And so here's the way this works. Alzheimer's disease ultimately is fundamentally an insufficiency in support of a neuroplasticity network in your brain, my brain, and all of our brains. So ultimately, you've got to support this network. And just like you'd support a country or a company, you've got a supply and you've got a demand. Now, what happens in everybody with Alzheimer's, the supply is too low and the demand is too high. And so you've got basic things like, is there ongoing inflammation, which requires more supply? Is there ongoing toxicity? Is there a reduction in energetics? And is there a reduction in growth factor activity, trophic activity, hormones, nutrients, and growth factors like nerve growth factor and BDNF and things like that? So when that equation is off, and so now you've got too much demand, whether it's because you have a leaky gut or a poor oral microbiome or chronic sinusitis, or, there are dozens and dozens of reasons. When you're off there, your brain has to, no surprise, downsize. And again, just as we were talking about earlier, it's like a state budget. If you've got to pay for a lot of Aduhelm, and then you're not going to be able to pay as much for education and for the police force and for all the other things that your state needs. And so to do that for something that doesn't work just makes no sense. So here's the issue. When we then go about preventing and reversing cognitive decline, and we were the first to publish reversal of cognitive decline back in 2014, and I should add, we just finished a clinical trial where 84% of the people actually got better. So in fact, dramatically better results than with aducanumab. Whereas where aducanumab is just slowing the decline at its best, our trial actually showed people getting better. We actually put that on preprint servers, so-called medRxiv, a couple of weeks ago. So we're very excited about that. So the point is, when you go after this, whether it's for prevention, whether it's for reversal of cognitive decline, you need to measure all these different things that are contributing to the supply and the demand. You need to increase the supply and reduce the demand, and you get things back into register. And so this is where just using a monotherapy to take away this amyloid. And, why is the amyloid there? That's a really interesting point. The amyloid is actually a protective mechanism. It is part of your brain's response to insults. So we just heard, for example, with COVID-19 during the pandemic, what happened? People were dying from cytokine storm, as we've all heard. So you're making these cytokines as part of the inflammatory response. Well, guess what amyloid is? It's part of the inflammatory response. So in this case, instead of cytokine storm, you're dying from cytokine drizzle. So you've got this chronic production of amyloid, a chronic, mild production of these various cytokines. So it's as if you've got COVID-19, but it's a slow version over 20 years instead of over 20 days. That's the big difference. And so the idea of just getting rid of the amyloid doesn't comport with the way this actually works. And it doesn't actually fix all the other ongoing things. Now, if you've got, for example, you might be making amyloid because you have P. gingivalis, which is one of the things associated with poor dentition, basically. Well, now you're taking away the protection. So it doesn't really make sense. As I've pointed out, to others, look, if you've got the Mona Lisa, which is a beautiful painting, this is like your beautiful brain. People start throwing eggs at the Mona Lisa, you're going to put up a barrier to protect the Mona Lisa. That's the amyloid. It's the barrier. So taking down the barrier, as long as the people are still throwing the eggs, that's not going to help. And taking away the amyloid, as long as you've still got the various insults going on, and these include things, by the way, like insulin resistance. These include the things that we associate with chronic illness. No surprise. And so all these things are contributing, and simply taking away the barrier makes absolutely no sense. Now, it may work after you've taken away all the insults, but nobody's doing that. That's the problem.
When I first heard this idea that amyloids can be protective and there's good and bad, it immediately drew a parallel in my mind to cholesterol, where cholesterol gets vilified, but obviously you need cholesterol. Without cholesterol, we die, right? Is that as a layman's comparison, is that a fairly good analogy for people to think about?
Absolutely. And, I think over the years, what's happened is that in the 20th century, we were looking, and 20th century medicine was looking for, what can we find that seems to be associated with these diseases? And as you indicated, cholesterol was one of the things. It turns out, as you said, you need cholesterol. It's really it's a side effect. You need to go upstream. And this has been the issue with 21st century medicine, which is really about why. When I learned in medical school, 20th century medicine, it was all about what it is. What's the diagnosis? Hypertension or Alzheimer's or what have you. 21st century medicine is completely different. It's about why. Why did you get this problem? Why is your cholesterol high? Why do you have hypertension? Let's figure these things out. And now we can go after the root causes. And unfortunately, medical practice is stuck in the 20th century. And we've got these drugs that are trying to get rid of the things that really are not the causes of the problem. And I think it's a great example, because this is exactly what's going on with amyloid. Amyloid is not the cause of Alzheimer's. It is a response to the various insults that actually cause the Alzheimer's itself. And so therefore, simply this simple-minded idea of let's get rid of the amyloid and that'll get rid of the Alzheimer's has been proven to be incorrect.
If we went on the street right now and we asked 100 people, what degenerative illness are you most afraid of? I think zero people would say dementia and Alzheimer's, but statistically, it's like number 3, or maybe even in their family, number 2, right? Why is it that heart disease and cancer get so much attention? Why is it that they've entered the popular zeitgeist, but most people aren't even paying any attention to neurodegenerative decline? They don't know how to even think about it. Most of them haven't picked up any kind of book on brain health or thought about taking care of their brain. But since they were a child, they've learned about cardiovascular health. They've learned about, oxidant, radiation and oxidation and these kinds of things. What's going on?
It's a great point. And it's because of the dramatic effects that you see. So when someone drops dead in front of you with a heart attack, that really leaves an impression on your mind. And you're like, oh my gosh, this was horrible. It was heart disease. And so then we start looking and seeing, oh yeah, heart disease takes years to get to the point where you actually have a heart attack. The same thing with cancer. Someone has a lump or someone has a spot on their chest x-ray. Oh my gosh, it's cancer. And so these things are kind of in your face. They're really obvious. Whereas Alzheimer's, it's a very slow disease. And that's been one of the problems. It is a seductive reaper, as it were. So it is something that sneaks up on you. And therefore, people just thought, oh, it's part of normal aging. When you get old, you get feeble. And that's been written about for thousands of years. This was talked about, in the Ayurvedic texts. It was talked about in some of the Roman writings 2,000 years ago. And so we think of this as something that is part of normal aging, when in fact it is not. And in fact, everybody knows someone who's 90 or even 100 and very, very sharp. And you need not go through this. When you have problems with your thinking, there's a reason for it. However, to your point, in fact, things are beginning to change. When you go out and ask people who are aging, what is the thing they fear the most? It is now losing your mind. And this comes up again and again and again. So there is beginning to be a change where people realize This is a real concern. And, it's a huge problem because if you look at the entire population of the US, about 330 million people or so, about 45 million of us will die of Alzheimer's. It's now the third leading cause of death. As Professor Christine Yaffe from UCSF published a few years ago, it's now the third leading cause of death in the United States. It's actually the number 2 leading cause of death in the UK. So this is an incredibly common problem and one that is debilitating and very expensive. It's costing the U.S. close to $300 billion a year now, and has, as you know, huge impacts on family dynamics, and on family welfare and finances. So this is a huge, huge problem, and unfortunately one that is growing. So this is one of the reasons that this drug that doesn't work was approved, because everyone's just looking
wants
for
to do something.
Please give us something.
Give us
and
something,
unfortunately, this was something that doesn't work, but hopefully we will have things that will work. And our recent trial showed that a personalized medicine type of protocol where you now have larger data sets to find out what's driving this and you address those things actually works quite well.
I've heard you use the term cognoscopy, if I remember correctly. Can you explain what that is? And is that something you've invented? Is that a real thing we can go to our doctor and ask for? And what I mean is, for people who are listening today who are saying, my mother or my spouse or me, I'm feeling concerned about cognitive decline, I'm losing memories. How can people get checked up?
Yeah, great point. So it's a silly word I made up, cognoscopy, just because we all know that when we hit 50, we should get a colonoscopy. We should go in just to make sure that we're not going to die. And in fact, my wife and I, when we hit 50, had his and hers colonoscopies on Valentine's Day. We just said, you know what? Let's just take care of this. Let's make sure we're both cool. Then we'll go out to have some food later, something like that, and kind of laugh about it. So we got that over with. And it's a good idea for everybody. We all want to know that we're not going to die of colorectal cancer, of course. And yet, people hadn't said, well, wait a minute, what about the other end? What about a cognoscopy? And so you simply want to have, and I have to say it's much easier. Cognoscopy is much less unpleasant than a colonoscopy. So it's easy. You want to go, and you can actually go to mycognoscopy.com if you want and look. And you want to get 3 things. So the first thing is a set of blood tests that will look to see, okay, do you have specific risk factors? Just like we all know what our cholesterol and our blood pressure is, and with wearables, there's more and more. These wearables have been so fantastic. So you can now check your heart rate variability. You can now check your CGM, your continuous glucose monitoring. You can check your stages of sleep. You can check your oxygenation. These have been very helpful because these are so critical for our health. Well, you can now also get a cognoscopy. You can look at your risk factors. So step 1, some blood tests. Step 2, simple online cognitive screen, because again, this sneaks up on you. We've had a lot of people who say, I'm here for prevention. What it turns out, when you actually check where they stand, they've already started the earliest stages. So please don't wait. If you're 45 or older, please get out there and get yourself checked up. And then the third piece is optional. If you're completely asymptomatic and you're having no problems and you're scoring well on your simple online cognitive assessment, which is the step 2 part, you don't need an MRI with volumetrics. But look, if you're scoring poorly, or if you've got symptoms, you want to include that third step, which is an MRI with volumetrics. So it's actually looking at the size of your hippocampus and the size of your temporal lobe, things like that, because these tend to shrink down. Again, no surprise. If you're not supplying it, if you're demanding too much and not giving enough supply, you now downsize your brain. And that's what Alzheimer's is. It is a chronic downsizing in response to these various insults and insufficient support for your brain. And so that's a cognoscopy. I recommend anyone who's 45 or older, please get checked out, because the good news is if you start early, virtually everybody can be improved. And I should say, Alzheimer's comes in 4 stages. And the problem is that we as physicians have named it incorrectly. What we call mild cognitive impairment. So people think, oh, good, I'm mild, MCI. That's the third of 4 stages. It should be called advanced Alzheimer's disease, because that's the actual stage. So stage 1 is you have the beginning of the pathophysiology in your brain, but you feel fine. So that's the asymptomatic stage, which is like having pre-diabetes. This is pre-Alzheimer's. Then the second stage is called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. Really should be called early Alzheimer's disease. It's the beginning of the process. And everybody with SCI can be made better by doing the right protocol. But they wait. And so that period often lasts 10 years. So you can see the window is open to do a lot for cognitive decline. The problem is doctors don't. And so they say, yeah, you're not that bad. Come back next year. So the third stage, as I said, is MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And by the way, that's the one where they used this drug. And so they weren't even using the drug on really severe Alzheimer's patients. They were trying to start as early as possible to see if they could just get enough of an effect to be able to sell it for billions of dollars. And yet what they're saying now is everybody with Alzheimer's should try it. Even though they didn't treat the people in the later stages, they still like people to prescribe it in the later stages. So again, really more of a business decision than a healthcare decision, unfortunately. So that third stage is MCI. And again, part of the problem is people call it mild. As one of our patients said, and we have a book coming out in August, which is called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. 7 people wrote their stories about what it was like to get better from Alzheimer's on the protocol we developed. And one of them said, when they told me I had mild cognitive impairment, I said, there's nothing mild about this. And he said, I don't even know how to spell Alzheimer's, but I know I'm going to die from it. And by the way, all 7 are doing very, very well now. So the bottom line is that's the third piece. And then the last one is what we actually call Alzheimer's disease. And by the way, the mild cognitive impairment is like saying mildly metastatic cancer. There's nothing mild about it. It's a late stage of the problem. And then the final stage is what we refer to formally as Alzheimer's disease. To have formal Alzheimer's, you have to be, by definition, losing your ADLs, your activities of daily living. So you have to have problems with things like bathing yourself and taking care of yourself. Well, that's an end stage condition. Yeah. So the last thing you want to do is wait